Spring 1943. High above the coast of France, the radio chatter inside the cockpits of the German Luftwaffe crackled with something unexpected: laughter. For years, the German aces flying the Messerschmitt Bf 109 and the Focke-Wulf 190 had been locked in a deadly dance with the British Spitfire. The Spitfire was elegant, slender, and lethal, a dancer with a knife. But now, a new shape had appeared in the sky, escorting American bombers, and to the German veterans, it looked absolutely ridiculous. It was the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt. To the German eye, accustomed to the sleek, shark-like lines of their own interceptors, the P-47 was a monstrosity. It didn't look like a fighter plane, it looked like a mistake. It was huge, weighing over 7 tons fully loaded, more than twice the weight of a Spitfire. It had a massive barrel-chested fuselage and a snub nose that housed a gigantic radial engine. German pilots, arrogant from years of dominance, began to mock the American machine over the open airwaves. They called it the Fliegende Badewanne, the flying bathtub. Others called it the Milchflasche, the milk bottle, because of its thick, clumsy shape. "Look at them," one Focke-Wulf pilot reportedly jeered to his wingman. "The Americans are sending trucks to fight us." The math simply didn't make sense to the Luftwaffe. In the dogfighting manuals of 1943, agility was king. A fighter plane needed to turn tight, climb fast, and dance through the air. The P-47 looked like a brick. The German pilots assumed that this jug, short for juggernaut, would be a sitting duck. They believed that once they dragged this heavy beast into a turning fight, it would stall and fall out of the sky. When the P-47s first arrived with the 56th Fighter Group, commanded by the legendary Hub Zemke, the Germans treated them with disdain. They would dive on the P-47s, expecting the American pilots to panic. They saw the massive size of the Thunderbolt not as a threat, but a target they couldn't miss. But the laughter masked a fatal misunderstanding. The Germans saw the size, but they didn't understand the engineering. They didn't know that the Bathtub was actually a high-altitude Predator built around a massive turbocharger. They didn't know that the fat fuselage was packed with enough armor to stop a cannon shell. In those early months, the Luftwaffe pilots would engage the P-47s with a smirk, confident in their superior aerodynamics. They would tease the fat American cars in the sky. But as they closed the distance, preparing to slaughter the clumsy giant, they were about to learn a very hard lesson. The P-47 wasn't built to dance, it was built to destroy. The laughter was loud in the spring of 1943, but by summer, the joke would be over. The flying bathtub was coming for them, and it was bringing hell with it.
To understand why the P-47 Thunderbolt looked like a flying bathtub, you have to understand that it wasn't really a plane designed to carry an engine. It was a plane wrapped around a massive, complex lung. The heart of the machine was the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp. It was an engineering marvel, an 18-cylinder radial beast that pumped out over 2,000 horsepower. It was raw American muscle. But Alexander Kartveli, the genius designer behind the P-47, knew that raw power wasn't enough. The air war over Europe was moving higher and higher into the thin air of the stratosphere. At 30,000 feet, the air is thin. Ordinary engines choke and die because they can't get enough oxygen. The German Focke-Wulfs began to struggle at these heights. Kartveli's solution was a turbocharger, a device that spins at 20,000 RPM to force-feed air into the engine. But there was a problem. A turbocharger gets incredibly hot, red hot. If you put it next to the fuel tanks or the cockpit, you'd roast the pilot. So the engineers did something radical. They put the turbocharger all the way in the back, in the tail of the plane. This decision dictated the entire shape of the aircraft. To make it work, they had to run a complex system of massive ducts, pipes as wide as a man's torso, running the entire length of the fuselage. Air was scooped in under the nose, traveled all the way to the tail to be compressed, passed through an intercooler to cool down, and then shot back up to the engine. The P-47 wasn't fat because the designers were lazy. It was fat because it was essentially a hollow tube stuffed with plumbing. It was a flying refinery. This complex heart gave the P-47 a superpower that terrified the Germans: high-altitude dominance. While the nimble Bf-109s gasped for air at high altitudes, the P-47 breathed easily. It could outclimb and outrun them where the air was thinnest. And then there was the dive. German pilots had a standard escape maneuver. If you were in trouble, dive. A light plane like the Spitfire couldn't follow a heavy German fighter into a dive with its wings ripping off. But the P-47, it weighed 7 tons. When a Thunderbolt pilot pushed the stick forward, gravity and that massive R-2800 engine worked together. The P-47 dropped like a lead safe. It dove faster than any other propeller plane in the war. It could break the sound barrier in a dive, often locking its controls due to compressibility. The German pilots found that when they tried to dive away from the flying bathtub, the bathtub didn't just follow, it caught them. The beast didn't just have a heart, it had the weight of the world behind it.
To the German Luftwaffe, the American choice of weaponry seemed almost primitive. The Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs were armed with explosive 20 and 30 millimeter cannons, weapons designed to blow massive holes in bombers with a single hit. They looked at the P-47 Thunderbolt, armed with only machine guns, and scoffed. They called the .50 caliber a woodpecker, believing it lacked the crushing power of a can shell. They were making a fatal miscalculation. They were mistaking the Thunderbolt for a sniper when it was actually a flying chainsaw. The P-47 carried 8 Colt Browning heavy machine guns, 4 embedded deep within each massive elliptical wing. This was the 8-gun salute. When a pilot squeezed the trigger on the control stick, he wasn't just firing bullets, he was projecting a solid wall of lead and fire. The physics of the barrage were terrifying. Each gun fired roughly 800 rounds per minute. With all 8 blazing simultaneously, the Thunderbolt spat out over 100 rounds every single second. But the true genius lay in the convergence. American ground crews painstakingly aligned the guns so that the streams of bullets from both wings crossed at a single point, usually 250 to 300 yards ahead of the plane. At that precise distance, the firepower wasn't spread out. It was concentrated into a glowing ball of destruction no wider than a beach ball. For a German pilot, getting caught in this convergence zone was not a matter of taking damage, it was a matter of physics. When the stream of armor-piercing incendiary rounds connected with a Focke-Wulf 190, the results were catastrophic. The kinetic energy of thousands of heavy slugs hitting simultaneously didn't just punch holes, it shredded the airframe. The woodpecker didn't peck, it sawed. Gun camera footage from 1944 reveals the horror. Enemy planes didn't just smoke, they disintegrated. Wings were sheared off at the root. Fuselages snapped in half under the impact. Pilots reported seeing German fighters literally dissolve into clouds of aluminum confetti and fire. The recoil of the weapon system was so immense, generating tons of backward force, that firing a long burst would actually slow the 7-ton P-47 in mid-air, as if the pilot had tapped the brakes. And unlike the German planes, which carried limited cannon ammunition, sometimes only 60 rounds, the P-47 carried a staggering 3,400 rounds. It could stay in the fight, spraying death long after the enemy had run dry. The laughter of the Luftwaffe died out quickly. They realized that while a cannon might be elegant, the sheer brute force of the P-47's 8 guns was a force of nature.
It was an industrial-scale executioner that turned the skies over Europe into a graveyard for the Reich's finest.
In the summer of 1943, a new kind of horror began to spread through the mess halls of the Luftwaffe. It wasn't the fear of being outflown, it was the fear of fighting a ghost that refused to die. The German pilots discovered that the flying bathtub had a secret attribute that defied the laws of physics. It was nearly indestructible. The legend of the unkillable tank was cemented on June 26, 1943, in a story that sounds like a myth, but is verified by history. American pilot Robert S. Johnson was limping his P-47 back to England. His plane was already crippled, hydraulic fluid was leaking into the cockpit, burning his eyes, and his canopy was jammed shut. He was a sitting duck, flying low and slow. Suddenly, a Focke-Wulf 19 appeared on his tail. It was flown by none other than Egon Meyer, a ruthless German ace with dozens of kills. Meyer saw the smoking American plane and moved in for the execution. He lined up his sights and unleashed his 20mm cannons. Bang, bang, bang! Explosive shells slammed into the fuselage of the Thunderbolt. Johnson curled into a ball inside the cockpit, waiting for the inevitable fireball. The plane shuddered violently. Chunks of metal flew off. The rudder was shredded. But the P-47 didn't explode. It didn't spin. It just kept flying. Meyer was confused. He circled around and attacked again. He poured machine gun fire into the wings and engine. Bullets bounced off the armor plating behind Johnson's seat like hail on a tin roof. The P-47 absorbed the punishment that would have vaporized 3 Spitfires. Meyer pulled up alongside Johnson's ruined plane. The two pilots looked at each other. The German ace stared at the flying wreck, his face a mask of total disbelief. He couldn't understand how the machine was still in the air. Determined to finish the job, Meyer dropped back for a third pass. He held the trigger down until his guns clicked dry. He had emptied his entire magazine into the American. The P-47 groaned, but the massive Pratt & Whitney engine kept turning. Defeated not by skill, but by sheer American steel, Meyer pulled up beside Johnson one last time. He shook his head, rocked his wings in a salute of bewildered respect, and peeled away. He had run out of bullets before Johnson ran out of airplane. When Johnson finally crash-landed at his base, the ground crew tried to count the holes. They stopped counting after they reached 200. The plane had taken 21 direct hits from 20mm cannon shells. A single shell was usually enough to down a fighter. The P-47 had taken 21 and brought his pilot home. Johnson walked away without a scratch. This was the moment the laughter died. The Germans realized that the Jug was not just a heavy target, it was a flying tank. It demoralized them. What is the point of being an ace pilot if you can empty your guns into the enemy and he simply refuses to fall? The P-47 didn't just survive the impossible, it weaponized survival. By 1944, the skies over Europe had changed. The Luftwaffe, once the predator, had been hunted to near extinction. The P-47 Thunderbolt, the high-altitude king, no longer had enough enemies to fight at 30,000 feet. So the Jug came down. It descended from the stratosphere to the treetops, and in doing so it acquired a new name, one whispered with trembling fear by every German soldier on the ground: Jabo. Short for jogged bomber, the word became synonymous with sudden, violent death. The flying bathtub that German pilots had laughed at was now the ultimate terror of the Wehrmacht infantry.
The massive size of the P-47, once a target for mockery, allowed it to carry a payload that defied logic. A single Thunderbolt could lift off carrying two 1,000-pound bombs, rockets, and a full load of .50 caliber ammunition. It was essentially a flying artillery battery. For the German army, the Jabo meant the end of mobility. General Erwin Rommel himself wrote that the Allied fighter bombers had a paralyzing effect. German convoys, panzer divisions, and supply trains could no longer move during the day. If the sun was up, the Jabos were hunting. The terror was visceral. A German soldier would hear a low, guttural rumble, the sound of the massive R-2800 engine echoing off the hills. Seconds later, a 7-ton shadow would blot out the sun, hurtling over the trees at 400 miles per hour. The P-47s didn't just bomb, they strafed. Pilots described chopping wood, using their 8 machine guns to slice through locomotives and trucks. They flew so low that ground crews would often find pine needles and mud splattered on the windshields when the planes returned. They were fighting face to face. The devastation reached its peak at the Falaise Pocket and later during the Battle of the Bulge. As the German army tried to retreat, the weather cleared and the Thunderbolts were unleashed. The roads became slaughterhouses. P-47s rained down high-velocity aircraft rockets, or HVARs, that could crack a Tiger tank open like a tin can. One German tank commander, captured in 1945, looked at a P-47 parked on an airfield. He pointed to the massive bomb racks under the wings and shook his head. "That," he said, "is why you are here and I am a prisoner. We could fight your tanks, we could fight your infantry, but against that we were helpless." The pilots of the Jabo squadrons developed a ruthless efficiency. They destroyed bridges, rail lines, and horse-drawn supply carts. They starved the German war machine of fuel and ammo. The plane that had been mocked as a milk bottle had become the anvil upon which the Wehrmacht was smashed. By the time the Allies crossed the Rhine, the laughter was a distant memory. The P-47 Thunderbolt had proven that it wasn't just a fighter plane. It was the angel of death for the Third Reich, proving that while agility might win a dogfight, raw, overwhelming firepower wins a war. The Jabo didn't just defeat the enemy, it broke their will to fight.